Jumping straight into it today, I'm going to be taking this crusty 10-inch rack tom and turning it into a side snare. Here I begin by taking off the tension rods that hold the head on, as well as the mounting bracket. Removing the top head and noting that there's no resistance while doing so, leaving me to believe that everything is still true and in round. Flipping it over and repeating the process on the bottom. And just like that, wouldn't you know it, some disgust-a-dust. And since a drill and my fat hands both will not fit inside this small drum, I take a screwdriver to remove the screws that hold on the lugs. Now that I've got it down to this, let's see what I can do about turning it into a snare drum. It just so happens in my random salvage pile that I do in fact have the Orange County Travis Barker holographic wrap, and his signature kit from them came with a side snare, so perfect. On the back side of the wrap, just underneath the original mounting holes, I mark a line with a ruler and Sharpie to then follow with a razor blade, cutting the wrap to the correct depth. And a quick test fit before cutting it down to length. Now this next part gets a little sketchy, and if you have the money to buy the snare bottom hoop, then go for it. I start by finding the center between two lugs and marking it. I then take the distance between the lug and the center point underneath and divide that on both sides of the first mark. Then with the drill on those two marks, I make holes that will serve not only as the pilot holes, but the ends to where the strap goes through the rim. And here with a step bit, I drill out the holes a little bit larger to make sure I can get the jigsaw blade in there to cut out the rest. If you have a vise to lock the hoop into, I suggest doing so. Doing this by hand makes it 10 times harder. OSHA would have a field day with me. Again, repeating the same process on the other side of the rim. After getting those cut out with a file, I go in and clean up any rough edges, as well as clean up the sloppy cut that I made to make sure that when the snare straps go through, they lay on an even surface. And following up with multiple grits of sandpaper to ensure that it's extra smooth. Up next, I'm just making some marks here for mounting the throw off. And it just happens to line up with two already existing holes. With the drill bit, I size them up for some hardware. In here I'm doing the same thing for the butt plate. I just happen to have an old Ludwig one laying around, so that's what I'm going to use. After drilling those out, I like to take a step bit and kind of clean up the holes some. Onto the snare beds, I make the same marks on the actual shell as I did on the rim when I cut the holes out for the snare wires. In between those two marks, I begin by filing and sanding down a snare bed. Now, while I don't have an exact science as to what I'm doing here, and since there's a lot of controversy on the topic of snare beds, I go by look and feel and what I think is going to sound good on the drum I'm working on. Now that the hard part of this build is over, I can get to the easy part, which is cleaning up the lugs and the tension rods and any other hardware that go back onto the drum. After removing the gaskets, I can take the little swivel nut locks out. This stuff is pretty crusty, so I'm going to put it in a bath of evaporust and let it soak for a while. While the lugs and tension rods soak in the evaporust, I'm going to take the time to take some white lithium grease and go over the remaining screws and little rubber pieces that need to freshen up. Okay, the lugs have soaked for a while now, so I'm going to take those out and clean those up with a brass brush here. After that, while those dry off for a little bit, I'm going to take the rest of this Evaporust and pour it back into the container, making sure that I don't get the chunky stuff at the bottom for future projects. Now putting everything back together, I start with taking the lugs and putting in the swivel nut inserts. But before replacing the gasket and placing them on the actual drum, I like to take cotton and pack the inside of the lugs. This has just become standard practice for me ever since I started messing with the old vintage kits and the spring style lugs that they have. And one by one replacing the lugs on the drums by hand and making sure that I don't cross thread anything in the process before taking a screwdriver and tightening up one final time. Installing the throw off and installing the butt plate. Going through the pile, I found some clear 10-inch heads, and I'm going to put those on for now and make sure that there are no protrusions or anything that's going to potentially screw up a fresh set of heads that go on this thing, and making sure I can see through and know what's going on the inside as I tighten everything down. Classic me and wanting to get ahead of myself and play this thing, I forget to put the mounting bracket back on. And at this point, I'm geeked, everything's looking good, I'm ready to go, and wait a minute, you're meaning to tell me in all the pile of shit that I got, I don't have any 10-inch snare wires? The next day, I scour the town's local music shops, and lo and behold, nobody has anything. So it's back home to pay extra and play the waiting game. And in true online fashion, when paying for shipping, you order more crap. So a fresh set of Remo heads was a definite must. For the top head, I went with an Emperor coated, and for the bottom head, an Ambassador Hazy snare side. With a fresh head change, it looks a billion times better, and I finally got my snare wires in. Now that those are on, it's time to take a crack at it and see what this thing really sounds like. Armed with two standard SM57s, I have one on the top and one on the bottom. No EQ, no effects, just the raw sound of the final creation. Now it's your turn to go get creative, and until next time, drums, drums, drums.